This Week in Parasitism is brought to you by the American Society for Microbiology at microbeworld.org/TWiP. This Week in Parasitism, episode number 61, recorded on October 9th, 2013. Hi, everybody. I'm Vincent Racaniello, and you are listening to TWiP. And joining me today, right here in the TWiP studio, is Dickson Despommier.
Hello, Vincent.
Dickson has a brand new microphone.
He does.
He's all excited.
Yeah, who wouldn't be? You know,
And it's going to make you sound fuller.
That's what they said.
Because I've been told that you sound thin.
Really?
Yeah. Well, the other mic didn't have the presence of mine, so next to me you sound
well,
thin.
that's interesting.
So we bought Dickson a brand new mic. It's on a stand on the desk, so he's not wearing a headset.
What do you think they're going to say now?
I have no idea.
Sounds too full.
No, I don't think you can be too full, can you?
Not. Well, you can if you eat too much, but otherwise.
Why did you ask me if it was October 8th? It's not. It's the 9th.
It is the 9th.
Yeah, it's what it says on my computer right here. That's what I go by.
Wow. Then
it's Thursday.
I have an interesting evening ahead of me.
You have to leave now?
No.
We haven't even finished.
No.
We have a really interesting show today.
We do.
Aside from the usual email.
Yes.
We're
going to talk about ancient parasitic infections and how we knew that they were ancient.
Old poop, huh?
Yeah, we're going to talk about old poop. That's right.
So let me tell everyone how this originated. Paleoparasitology.
Paleoparasitology. That's the title of this show.
In fact, looking through the literature,
that's what they call it.
It's a real field.
It is a genuine field of interest. And
in virology, we have a field called paleovirology.
See that?
But we don't look at fossilized poop. We look at sequences.
Right.
Fossilized sequences, actually.
Indeed.
And the best way is if you have a viral sequence integrated into the cellular genome, then you can do phylogenetic analysis and see how far back it goes in evolution.
Yeah, well, that's kind of a virtual fossil
but you can't
record.
do that. You can't do that with parasites because they don't integrate.
That's all true.
And in fact, not all viruses integrate. So we have to use different tricks for other viruses.
Right.
One of them is to look at cellular genes that antagonize the virus and try and see if you can see a conflict between cellular and viral genes that goes way back.
Sure. Yeah,
but in parasites, we look at poop. Actually, we do other things too.
Well, they're also doing PCR too. They're doing some
but you can't
sophisticated molecular.
You can't get very old samples, though.
No, you can't. But they did find some dinosaur skin once that looked pretty mummified and pretty accessible to chemical analysis.
So they got Neanderthal sequence from what?
From bone.
And how
Mostly
old is that?
Skull bones. Neanderthals lived about 30,000 years ago.
Okay.
That was the last age of Neanderthals.
So that DNA was intact.
Yeah, or some
intact
of it.
enough to get sequences.
Well, they could put in the missing pieces that they use the human genome to sort of compare to.
Now, so you're not going to get million-year-old specimens. That's the problem.
Well, yes and no.
I don't think so. I don't think.
No,
well, not with DNA. You might get morphological things,
Right.
But not DNA. There's no Jurassic Park here.
Well, that's right. Because actually, one of the key players here is George Poinar, who wrote a book called Life in Amber, which I have used as a pick of mine in episodes past. And George is active in this field of paleoparasitology still.
Yeah.
And quite an interesting field. Once you start looking into it and find out what you can learn from knowing where parasites were at the same time as where people were. Mm-hmm. Remember, we only came to this part of the world by that land bridge, or at least we think we came by that land bridge, during our own migration out of Africa. And there are some intriguing studies with regards to paleoparasites, which suggests that perhaps we picked another route to migrate as well because of the lack of their considerable need for surviving long enough to be transmitted as we migrated, so to speak. So there are some interesting speculations that we have to talk about today.
Can I start with a segue about how we got to this topic?
But of course.
Would you mind? I know this is your
please,
show.
Please.
You're the boss.
No, it's our show. It's our show, please.
So on TWiP, a couple of weeks ago,
Yeah.
one of our listeners sent in an email about dinosaurs, because I had mentioned on TWiP
Right.
that they were dumb, and that's why they lived more than anybody else.
Right.
And that's not the point of this. This fellow wrote in, and somehow someone found this article in PLOS 1, which
Right.
was published, when was this published? 2009, a couple of years ago. It's called Common Avian Infection Plagued the Tyrant Dinosaurs, meaning Tyrannosaurus, right?
Yeah.
This is very, I had sort of peripherally seen this, and I showed this to you, and you said we have to do an episode on this
And
stuff.
now we're doing it.
Can we talk about this first?
The Trichomonas gallinae? Sure.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So the T-Rex, they collected all the known, or many of the known T-Rex fossils.
and they have a lot of them, by the way. That's incredible that there are so many.
60?
Yeah, that's a lot. That's a
60
lot.
some odd?
Yeah, considering
Yeah,
that it
they
was a
have
predator.
61 tyrannosaurid individuals. So each one is an individual.
Yeah,
You know, the
well.
most famous one?
Sue.
Right.
It's at the, I believe it was sold from Chicago to New York, if I'm not mistaken.
Oh, it's in New York?
I believe it's now in New York.
I don't know.
That's the speculation on
How
my
much
part.
was it?
It was at the Museum of Natural History in Chicago.
And they didn't want it?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I know who bought it. Remember, we talked about this briefly some other time. There was a colleague of mine's son who is a paleontologist and has moved since being in the Chicago Museum of Natural History, now works at the American Museum of Natural History in New York City. His son actually, through the museum's permission in Chicago while he was still there, bid on Sue and bought it for the museum. So he was responsible for bringing that dinosaur to the public.
It's currently in the Feld Museum in Chicago.
Feld. Okay, so it's still there. That's
It's
fine. He's not, but it is.
It's the largest, most extensive, and best preserved T-Rex specimen ever found.
Right.
9 tons.
Right. Huge.
Oh my God.
Huge.
Can you imagine encountering this thing?
No, not really. No, I can't. No,
9 tons.
I've watched Jurassic Park
Anyway, this
several
is-
times, and it's really a frightening scene when the Tyrannosaurus Rex attacks the
Crowd.
Jeep.
Anyway, it wasn't just Sue in this paper. They
Yeah.
examined 61.
Right.
So these skeletons have holes in their jawbones,
They do.
the mandibles, right?
That's right.
And they're trying to figure out why these are here. And their theory is that they're caused by, what is it again?
Well, Trichomonas gallinae, because
Why?
Because there are two kinds of holes. The first kind is made by a puncture wound from a tooth,
Right.
from another predator, or from a scavenger if you just happen to die. Okay.
Right.
And that's a jagged type of hole that would be created by, let's say, a pointed tooth.
Right.
Even though it might have some sharp edges to it, it's going to make a puncture wound which will shatter bone. If, on the other hand, it's a pathological condition caused by a microbe, it's much more likely to be a smooth, rounded hole. And therefore, when they started to look back over these specimens, someone said, this doesn't look like a puncture wound.
Smoothed edged.
So they do a
They look
CSI.
They look erosive.
They do.
Do you know what that means?
Yeah, that
erosive?
means that they ate their way through.
So another T-Rex didn't
No.
bite it, but
No, but it
And
may
they-
have been the cause of the death of the T-Rex.
and they have pictures of them here.
They
They're
do,
quite
that's right.
big.
They're huge.
I have never seen these before.
Because modern birds, by the way, get a throat-like infection from a similar pathogen, Trichomonas gallinae.
Trichomonas is, of course, the single-celled protozoan.
Correct. Oh, Vincent, I've brought you into the modern era. Oh, I'm so proud of myself.
Has a little flagellum, right?
Yes.
And in people it causes vaginitis.
And it's a
right?
eukaryotic. Well,
that's
Trichomonas
what
vaginalis does.
Vaginalis,
yes.
right? But there are
That's
other
right.
species,
There are
right?
many, many, many
And
species
they're
of
all
trichomonads.
unicellular protozoans.
They are
And
unicellular.
They infect birds,
They do.
and they cause a erosion of the jaw.
They do, and the throat actually. But remember, dinosaurs gave rise to the boids.
I heard.
So, So it's very interesting because there's a guy out in, I believe he's in Montana. His name is Jack Horner.
Moving to Montana. Do you know who did that song?
I don't.
Frank Zappa.
Oh, right. Right.
You know they have dental floss farms in Montana? It's in that song.
Another thing I didn't know. They have a lot of good trout fishing there, though. And that's why I would go out there. But I've also visited Montana State University's museum, where I believe Jack Horner is the curator. And so they started...
He's on this paper.
He is. And he started to look back over...
John Horner.
John. Well, where does he locate it? Maybe he's in Denver. I think there might be somebody else in Montana State.
Let's see.
Does it say where he is?
Hang on.
Because I'm a big fan of their Discovery Channel shows that they have every now and then. It'll say where he is.
Why don't they say where these people are?
I don't know, but if you typed it out...
Montana State University and Museum of the Rockies.
Well, there he is. And that's a great place. I highly recommend it to anybody.
Wow. It's in Bozeman. Great. I was there and I never saw this.
Yeah, well, that's your loss. You could have
nice.
gone.
You're nice guy. You're really nice to me.
Well, you're going to go back. You'll go back. You don't know, but you'll go back.
So what the contemporary birds get?
Contemporary birds get some
Gallinae. Is that what it's called?
Gallinae.
From gallinaceous birds.
Yeah.
What are gallinaceous birds? You don't know?
I'm not a bird person. Sorry.
I can look it up.
You could.
Gallinaceous relating to the galliforms, which are domestic poultry and game birds.
Okay, there you go. Like
turkey,
pheasants.
Grouse, chicken, new and old world quail, partridge, pheasant in a pear tree. Sorry, I'm silly today.
That's okay. That's okay. Yes, you are.
And these get these Trichomonas gallinae, and they erodes their jaws, right?
And in their esophageal.
So how do they acquire these infections?
Well, I don't think trichomonads produce cysts. So they have to be contacted from another animal that was already infected, which begs the question, well, where did that animal get it from?
Birds don't eat other birds.
Yes, they do.
They do?
Oh, my gosh. Are you kidding? The raptors make a living at it. Of course they do. Sure. The fish eagles, not the fish eagles, but the African...
Does a chicken eat another chicken?
No, of course not.
So how would it get it? From
but
contaminated food?
But it might peck at a dead chicken.
Oh, it might? Okay.
It might.
So they examined all these 61 bones, and 15% of them had Trichomonas-type lesions, they call them, on the mandible.
Amazing. Now, my big question would be, of course, could other things cause these lesions besides trichomonads? Which is a legitimate question. Could it be a bacterial infection? Could it be, what else could it be? It couldn't be birth defects, that's for sure.
Bacterial infections.
Could it be?
Make abscesses, fungal infections, they say,
Yeah. But there is a modern equivalent to that infection which we can point to and say, if we trace it back, it's probable that this was the cause. So
they
it's
say,
a probable cause.
Your avian trichomonosis is a strongly erosive parasitic infection.
Right. It plagues the poultry industry, I can tell you that.
And they say that, well, of course they can't prove that this is caused by Trichomonas, but all the evidence suggests it strongly, right?
That's right.
The interesting thing is they don't find it in other dinosaur skeletons.
Right.
They looked at some others.
Right.
And they don't find it at all.
That's right.
They talk a little bit about how they might have acquired it, by eating something, or by fighting, one thing.
Well, what is another modern equivalent infection, by the way, Vince, that you and I have talked about in the past, which is not a trichomonad, but which also is involved in almost the extinction of an animal species because they like to bite each other on the face.
Oh, these those guys in the Tasmanian devils.
Exactly.
That's right. They're spreading a cancer by biting each other.
Exactly.
Ooh.
Exactly.
So the T-Rexes probably fought. They could bite each other.
You imagine one carcass, 5 Tyrannosaurus rexes.
Yeah, but
who owns
if
them?
there's a dead T-Rex, they're going to eat it, and
That's
they could acquire the infection. They think it might have initiated in the throat.
Could be.
Like it does in birds, and then spreads to the mandible.
Yeah, it's possible.
They also speculate that it gets worse enough they can't eat, right?
Right. So maybe Sue starved to death.
But do you think a T-Rex would not eat because it hurt?
Ooh, well, it happens in other animal species.
I think that a T-Rex would eat until its jaw broke. But we don't find any. Do we?
Wait a minute. There was a nature show on television very recently about a family of lions, or lionesses, I should say. Maybe there were 6 or 8 lionesses, and they hung around a swampy area in Africa, and one of the female lions, because that's mostly what prides of lions are females and their offspring. One of them had a broken jaw.
Interesting.
And this was a lion that had a broken jaw like for years. And the animal couldn't hunt. Okay? And so they were wondering how this animal stayed alive. And so they observed the pride for about 6 months, and they found out that what they would do, because they showed altruistic behavior here. It was quite amazing. The female lion with the broken jaw would sit next to a kill that the pride had taken down. Let's say it was a water buffalo or a gazelle or a zebra. And what they would do is they would save all of the soft parts for this poor female that couldn't chew very well. And she would go in, and they would make room for her. They wouldn't crowd her out. They wouldn't fight her off. They would allow her to feed. So, it's interesting to ask, well, did that behavior exist in other animals too? They were quite surprised to see it happen in lions, because they're usually thought of as very aggressive animals. But in this one instance, they found a nice, warm, tender pride of lions that really cared for their elders and wanted to keep her alive, because she had all the institutional knowledge. She would tell stories around the campfire, that sort of thing.
So basically we have this scenario where these tyrannosaurs probably acquired this infection from either each other or from some other meat that was contaminated from it, eroded their jaw, and they say it may have plagued them. It's interesting.
So this points up the fact that populations of large host animals and plants, their populations are controlled by their parasites and their microbes.
Okay, so this is actually an interesting question. So these dinosaurs lived millions of years ago, right?
That's right. At least 65 million years ago, that's right.
So I bet the parasites like these were there way before. But how early? How many cells do you need in an organism to have it parasitized?
Yeah, that's a great question.
By a eukaryotic parasite. A great question. So life initially evolved in complex ways in the oceans, right?
That's what the speculation is, of course.
So, there are multicellular organisms this day that are in the ocean, like rotifers. Not oceans, but rotifers are.
No, there are rotifers in the ocean.
Yeah, sure. Could you have a parasite infecting a rotifer?
Of course you could. In fact, don't you remember Metchnikoff's original observations?
No, I don't. You don't personally remember them.
Well, Metchnikoff was a Russian scientist, and he worked at the same time that Louis Pasteur worked. And there's a portrait of Metchnikoff at the Pasteur Institute in Paris, because what he became famous for was to describe what happens to fungal spores that invaded Daphnia, which is a little copepod, very similar to, it's a crustacean. Right?
Yes, it's beautiful.
And it's very beautiful, as a matter of fact.
Planktonic crustacean, 2 to 5 millimeters in length.
Yeah. So what he was studying was, how does the Daphnia fight off its microbes? Right. And Romanovsky was also another hero, because Romanovsky developed the stains necessary for you to be able to see the cells under the microscope, so that you could at least observe what was going on. So there was a whole series of connections that the Pasteur Institute likes to celebrate.
So this is fun because it combines our two loves, parasites and dinosaurs.
That's exactly right. Every little kid develops a love for dinosaurs. That's right. And then here's a great excuse for talking about them again.
So I showed you this, and you said, I'll have to see if we can find some other papers, and you found a slew of them.
There's a gigantic...
There's a huge literature.
We had the tip of an iceberg here.
Which is called Paleoparasitology.
That's right, Paleoparasitology.
And let me just
So here it
I took
is.
all the papers you sent me.
Yeah.
So let's go through each of them, and
Let's
you can
do that.
explain
I will do my
exactly
best.
what is going on. All right?
Or
Now,
they can.
apparently, I have a nice slide study here.
yeah.
You sent me this PDF, which is a bunch
Oh,
of
listen, wait a minute.
slides.
Can I interrupt you for just
You
another
can,
moment?
of course.
Because this also was triggered by a recent finding that appeared in, of course, the world's greatest news service besides Reuters, Yahoo News. And, of course, I check that about once every hour when I'm at my computer just to see if something interesting happened. Like, for instance, our government might have decided to actually behave like a government, which hasn't happened yet, but it could. Just keep watching. It could. So what did they discover about maybe 2 months ago now? Maybe it was a little earlier than that.
Yes.
They discovered the gravesite of the real Richard III.
What, that wasn't the real gravesite?
No,
the
it
one
was.
they
It
had
was. They had
before?
looked for it for many years and hadn't found it. And finally, some archaeologists determined that this is the place where King Richard III was buried. Now, I must confess that I didn't go immediately out and pick up a copy of Shakespeare's King Richard III and read it to make sure that I knew who King Richard III actually was. But it turns out, just from that article in Yahoo News, that King Richard III was thought of as not such a great king. He was kind of a nasty person, and he was killed in battle. All right, but his body was
Bosworth
buried.
Field.
See, the Battle of Bosworth.
Is
You know
that,
about this?
Is that the one that Shakespeare wrote about?
No, that was Dunstan. That was the forest.
Do you remember the Battle of Agincourt? That was an
don't.
earlier
No,
Richard.
I don't,
Or was
actually.
that a Henry? Hold it.
Yeah,
Because if we don't get it
we're
right, our listeners
dredging on
will-
very, very, very thin
The Battle
ice
of
here.
Agincourt was during the 100 Years' War, and this was Henry V. Sorry, it wasn't
Henry
Richard.
V. Right.
I like Agincourt because
It's got a nice ring
the
to it.
the Brits were outnumbered by the French, but the British won. They were hopelessly outnumbered.
Hopelessly.
However, Richard III was killed in the Battle of Bosworth Field in 1485. He was 32 years old.
Wow.
And it was the last battle of the War of the Roses,
Ah.
actually. And he was succeeded by Henry VII.
Well, there you go. So, but what they found at his gravesite, you see, now we have the ability to check for all kinds of nuance.
So what did they do?
Well, they took samples because his body was buried in such a way that it was almost like the fetal position. Okay, and what they did was they
bones
took
were still there because this
bones
is
were still there.
1485,
That's
so the
right.
bones are intact. It was
Sure, of
buried
course.
properly, right?
And they wanted to do some forensics. They wanted to know if he had any maladies that they could identify, like polio, or maybe he had osteomyelitis, or maybe he had syphilitic teeth, or you can tell a lot by looking at a body what kind of pathogens they might have suffered from.
How did they know it was Richard III?
Well, that's a very good question. Also, did they do a DNA typing and trace it
Yeah,
back?
they got mitochondrial DNA,
yeah.
and they matched it
That's
to
right.
a descendant of his sister, Anne of York,
Look at
and
that.
a second distant relative.
Look at that.
And I also said that there are battle wounds on the bones and scoliosis, which
And scoliosis, that's
Was-
right.
he
So
was
he
known
was
to
he
have.
was a deformed person to begin with. So
kind of like you.
exactly like me.
And what did
Except
they-
I was taller than he
So
was.
this was, let's say this was Richard III. So how did they know he had a parasite?
Well, what they did, Vince, was they took samples of the crypt where he
Right.
was buried, and they took it back to the laboratory, and they carefully kept track of where they took the samples from.
Mm-hmm.
And when they started to look at them under the microscope, lo and behold, when they got to this part of the body that corresponded to where the small intestinal tract would have been when the body was placed in the grave,
I see.
they found something quite remarkable. What did they find? They found remnants of a roundworm infection, which I'm sure everybody out there knows about now because we've talked about it several times on This Week in Parasitism. It's called Ascaris lumbricoides.
Sure, we did a whole show on
We
it.
did an entire show on this. So Ascaris lumbricoides, and they didn't find a few eggs. They found millions of eggs. Now, when they said that, of course, if our listeners could go back to the episode that we talked about Ascaris lumbricoides, the life cycle, they would remember that that worm, the female worm, which is quite large, by the way, about the size of a waterman's pen, turns out to produce 200,000 eggs per day.
This is not the giant kidney roundworm.
No. They estimated based on their sampling of the area where the intestinal tract eventually decayed and released the worms, and they decayed and released the eggs, and so that's the sequence of events that one might imagine happened. That they found so many eggs that they could only estimate that this poor king was loaded with ascaris, and yet, if each female worm can produce 200,000 eggs per day, and let's say he had 20 worms, which is not a lot of worms, how many eggs is that?
20 times how much? 200?
200,000.
Yeah, it's a lot.
It is. It's 4 million eggs, right?
And would he be suffering?
Not if he had 20 of them, he wouldn't. Unless they decided to migrate.
Out of the intestine?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. But I would say if he had 100, of course he would. But nonetheless, he had them, okay, which means, of course, now how do you catch ascaris?
Ascaris lumbricoides.
Right.
I'll have to go back to TWiP.
No, Vincent is checking our archives now. This is a good idea.
Is it ascaris?
Yeah, ascaris. And it's the same way you catch trichuris, by the way, too. And I'm surprised.
Trichuris.
I'm surprised they didn't look for trichuris. I mean, they might have looked for
the giant intestinal worm,
That's
Ascaris
right.
lumbricoides.
Right. Yes. And so you have to know.
Just with that big jug, you have a picture of that from
exactly
the
right.
little village.
That's right. That's right.
All right. What did you ask me?
I asked you how
catch it?
you caught the infection.
Eggs are ingested.
From?
So you ingest eggs.
From?
Fecal contamination.
There you go. This is the King of England. Vincent, the King of England is subjected to fecal contaminated water or food. I thought it was nice to be the king. You know, I saw that movie with Mel Brooks, and he says, it's nice being king, and then he did some things. But in this case, it wasn't so nice to be the king.
No,
Not only was it...
The handlers of his food probably had feces on their hands.
Well, it depends on where his food came from, too. You know, you always imagine kings of England sitting there with gigantic legs of roast of lamb, something like that.
Yeah, but remember... Back then, we didn't know anything about sanitary behavior. So the food preparers didn't wash their hands after going to the bathroom.
Not only that, they didn't have any forks and knives either. They didn't use utensils. They used their hands.
Yeah, it was pretty bad.
Okay.
Can you imagine being a serf?
I can, but here's the deal, though. If you're going to speculate that somebody serving the King of England could transmit ascaris through fecal contamination of their own feces to the king, that's not right.
Well, it wouldn't happen today, but I can
It wouldn't
see
be right.
it
No, it wouldn't be right even then.
Why?
Because the eggs have to incubate.
You should read a history of the early British kings. It was pretty brutal.
No, but the point is the eggs have to incubate for a week before they're infectious in the soil. They're not immediately infectious. It takes a week for them to embryonate.
So it has to come from the soil?
Yeah.
All right, you know what the latrines were like in these castles?
Well.
They used to have these, you would sit on a commode and then the material would go down
that's true.
A tunnel into a part outside the
Where
castle.
did it go? Into the moat?
Moat, probably.
You think it went into the moat?
Yeah, why not? Fill the moat with poop.
Really?
That way the people won't come through
it was called a commode rather than a commode?
I've seen pictures. I did a lot of traveling in the UK.
Yeah.
And I always visited castles.
Right.
So I read a
They're
lot
cool
about
stuff,
them.
right? They're
and,
cool.
They would have these chutes going down in the walls of the castle that would empty out next to the castle on the back side of the castle, so you wouldn't smell it.
So then
the guy who's preparing the food said, "Would you go out back and get some sticks for the fire?" And he goes out and he steps in this poop infested area, and then he wipes it on his hands, and then he contaminates the food. You can imagine the scenarios. Dickson.
I can imagine many scenarios. For instance, they may have even used the poop as fertilizer.
Possibly.
On their crops. Right? So that's why the king's garden was always
back then, I'll bet a big fraction of the British population had ascaris.
Well, that's the conclusion that you have to reach. Because if the king had it,
everybody had it.
By God, man.
And then all his helpers had it too, and all his court.
In fact, if you didn't have it, you weren't a loyal British citizen of the king.
Cool thing about this story is that they had just found his grave underneath a parking lot in Leicester.
Right.
So they hadn't known where he was.
Right.
They found it, they dug it up, and boom, it's King Richard III, and he has ascaris.
How about that?
All right, that's pretty cool.
Very.
And we'll put a link to that.
But it's not so old. I mean, it's not old enough, so you'd say, well, 1400s, you'd assume that ascaris would be around that long. So what is the oldest record of a parasitic infection from, let's say, a worm
Yes.
in humans.
In humans, I don't know.
Right. So it was almost the first paper ever published on this subject, too.
Mm-hmm.
1910. What do you think they would
Oh, I
publish
know.
on in
I have that
1910?
right here.
Yeah,
This
of course.
fellow,
Yeah.
what's his name?
Not Carter.
Armand Rufer was the first to
That's
record
right.
parasite
That's
eggs
right.
in mummified tissues of an Egyptian
Mummified
mummy.
tissue. So what kind of parasites would you find in a mummy from Egypt, do you think?
Schistosomes?
Bingo! And I was surprised. So schistosomes are animals, parasites that infect snails first, right? And then the snails give off a stage, which then
Right.
swims in the water and attacks you as you swim or as you wade in the water, okay?
Right,
So
right.
mummies, I mean, everybody was associated with water in those days. They used the water for irrigation for their crops. They swam in it, they boated in it, they played in it. They probably even fought in it because everybody lived near the Nile River.
Right.
Okay, and it flooded every
They were in
every year.
denial.
They were in denial. That was a bad joke, Vincent.
I
think
know,
you
I'm
can
not a
do
good
better.
comedian.
You can probably do better than
All right.
that. Okay, we'll try harder next time.
Armand Rufer.
Armand.
So he found
Rufer.
this in the mummies, which were well
He did.
preserved.
That's right. And the eggs were all over the place. Okay, but
In the
but they
intestines, too?
also, they were in the tissues. They're all over the place.
Okay.
No. Well, probably in the intestines. Sure,
Schistosomes,
of course. So, but what other parasite did they find? This was very interesting.
I don't know.
They found tapeworms. They found a teniid egg.
Not trichinella.
No, that's right. Not Trichinella.
They
That is
found
right.
Taenia solium.
Tenia.
or
They didn't know.
Taenia, some
They don't
kind.
know because the egg of tenias all look the same. So you can't tell whether it was from pork or beef. But it did tell you one thing. What did it tell you?
They ate meat?
They're eating raw meat.
They ate raw meat or not well-cooked
Not
meat.
well-cooked meat. That's exactly right.
Interesting.
That's exactly right. Yep. So there's another cultural habit that you can learn by simply discovering which parasites they acquire, right?
So this fellow who found the first ones in Egypt, he didn't actually coin the phrase paleoparasitology. It was coined by Luis Fernando Ferreira at the Oswaldo Cruz Foundation.
Which publishes a large volume of literature on this subject, as I found out.
Paleoparasitology?
Yeah. I sent you a lot of them from that source.
So that brings us to coprolites.
It does. Coprolites. And to paleofeces.
Wow.
So paleofeces is referred to only for animal sources, like dinosaurs or dogs, by the way. They had dogs preserved.
Fossilized feces, right?
Yeah, fossilized feces, but not humans. Humans, it's referred to as coprolites.
Why?
I don't know. They just came up with that term.
So then in the 40s and 50s, they found parasite eggs in coprolites
yeah,
of
that's right.
various sorts.
That's right.
And there are lots of papers on this.
That's right. So I must tell you now about my former chairman's favorite humorous, I guess it's a story he told, about two paleontologists. One was on a field trip down in, let's say he was in Peru, looking at mummies, and he got into a cave, and he found coprolites. Okay?
Human?
Human. So he wanted to send a message back to his associate. Let's say he was at Cambridge in England. He wanted to telegraph him. So you have to use a few words. You can't use a lot of words on these
Right.
telegraph
It's like
messages.
Twitter.
So it's like Twitter. He wanted to tweet the fact that he had made a discovery. So he sent the following message back to his colleague. He said, no. First of all, he said, what was that cave? So they transferred information back. Well, it was a cave that was sealed off, so it was certain that nobody recently had gone into this cave. It was an old cave. The mummy was untouched, and yet next to that mummy, there was a coprolite. But the mummy didn't make the coprolite. This was
Right.
like, gee, how did that happen? Okay, so here's the explanation that the anthropologist sent back to his colleague. He said, here's what must have happened. Some creep crept into the crypt and crept.
That's a bad joke,
It
Dickson.
was terrible. But I remember Philip D'Alessandro, who was a dear friend of mine and a dear colleague of mine, used to get hysterical when he started to tell that because he thought it was just the most humorous thing he could say at that moment whenever this topic came up. And so some creep crept into the crypt and crept. You can use this as a way of like making sure that your diction works properly.
Should we make that the title of this episode?
Yeah, we definitely have to make it the title.
Not paleoparasitology.
No. It's going to be some creep crept into the crypt and crept.
Into the crypt
and crept. That's the title of this episode.
Crept.
And this is
wow.
And then you have to put an asterisk over that saying, and you have to attribute it to Dr. Philip A. D'Alessandro.
He said it?
I heard it from
Phil
him.
D'Alessandro?
Yeah, that's right.
I thought he was your chairman at Notre Dame.
No, he was my chairman here.
Oh. I know Phil.
Yeah, sure.
He's still around, right?
He is. Lives over in Demorest, New Jersey, yeah.
We should get him on TWiP. Would he have anything to say?
I don't know. I don't.
Too old?
Well, not so. Well, I don't know. You can never be too old to have something to say.
No, I'm sorry. I didn't mean that. I just meant maybe.
It's all right. You can edit that out later.
No, I won't. But what I mean is maybe he's not.
Maybe he's not keeping up with the literature.
No,
anymore.
not that. But just not able to talk.
I don't know.
Maybe he's debilitated.
You know, it's funny because we haven't remained close after he retired, and so I really feel the absence of his presence.
So let me tell you some of the.
Please go ahead.
This is a wonderful slide stack you found from.
It's
from. Actually, it's called Paleoparasitology: Ancient Parasite Infections in the Old World.
Was that one from the Smithsonian?
It's from the Oswaldo Cruz.
Oh, okay.
And a couple of other places.
All right.
And they talk about. So here's a lot of coprolite stuff.
Yeah.
A pinworm egg in
That's
a
right.
human coprolite, 6,000 years old from Chile.
Right.
They also have a helminth eggs found in
Ascaris is common, Trichomonas is common.
Helminths.
What they haven't
Lots
found
of
that's
helminths.
common, maybe because the eggshell doesn't survive very well, is hookworm. Because I'm sure hookworm's all over the place also, but I haven't seen any reference to hookworm. Whereas Tania eggs have these very thick outer coatings, and Ascaris and Trichomonas, they're robust eggs.
Giardia.
No.
They said they found
a Giardia cyst, sure.
They have Entamoeba.
A cyst.
Strongyloides.
Really?
Yeah. Ascaris.
That's not, Strongyloides doesn't.
No. It says helminth eggs. So the eggs.
Very unusual.
It's Ascaris enterobius.
Yeah, that's a pinworm egg.
Hymeneleptid cestode.
That's a tapeworm.
It's a cestode.
Yep. Yeah.
And
so they survive. And
so coprolites are the very
sure.
common way to find them. They have some nice pictures of coprolites here.
Right. And they, by the way, they also have evidence for Trypanosoma cruzi because they can do PCR.
Right.
And in mummies, particularly in Peru, they found these really, it's kind of a tragic story because these little girls were sacrificed and put up on a mountaintop and bundled up after they were killed, and by a blow on the head, by the way.
Mm-hmm.
But they were given a drug before that to sort of make them unconscious or at least take their minds off what's going to happen. Why they were killed, we have no idea because ancient rituals are obscure.
Mm-hmm.
But they found evidence for Trypanosoma cruzi in some of these mummies that they exhumed and then did forensics on. You know, I was looking, what's the most famous, by the way, recent mummified person, actually not even mummified, that we have heard a lot about in recent times is this guy Otzi, the Iceman that they got out of the Alps. He was snowed in, so to speak, and frozen. And then because of global climate change, in case nobody believes that's happening, just look what... We would have never discovered Otzi if the ice had not melted. And there he was, frozen, face down on a mountaintop, or a pass, a mountain pass.
Mm-hmm.
And they removed his body. Unfortunately, they broke his penis off when they did that.
Mm-hmm.
He was actually frozen, and they didn't realize it, of course, and when they turned him over, they broke it off. So they broke off a lot of other things, too, as they did that. They brought him back, and they kept him frozen. Mm-hmm. And they've done, like, an entire CAT scan on Otzi, and they've had several National Geographic shows about his organs, and lo and behold, they discovered something about going back and looking again. What is that? and it turned out to be a spear point.
A spear point.
An arrow. It was an arrow
Cool.
point. And then they looked at his skull and they realized that he had died from a blow on the head. So maybe shot at first, injured, he went down, the person who shot the arrow rushed over to him and bludgeoned him to death. And that's how he died. So it tells you a lot about sociological. But the thing about Otzi was that his stomach was full of food.
Mm-hmm.
So the mystery was, if he was running away from somebody, you wouldn't really eat on the run, right? So what they speculate was that this person who killed him was a friend of his. Or at least he knew him.
Right.
All right. So what they tried to do next was to find evidence for parasitism.
How old was this fellow again?
He was in his 40s, I think.
How old?
Oh, you mean he was
Geological
a Stone
time.
Age type person.
Okay.
So he was like 5,000 years old, I think, or something close to that. We could tell by just looking him up. But the point is that they didn't find any.
Right.
And then they found his medicinal kit that he was traveling with. And there was a fungal infection of birch trees, a fungal native to birch trees,
Right.
which produces a certain kind of acid, which, at least in experimental situations for helminth infections in rodents, it clears the infection. So was Otzi carrying this to clear his own infection because he didn't have any evidence for the infections?
Interesting.
And he should have had some evidence for it.
That's cool.
It is very cool. So it probably says that ancient traditional medicines were tried by trial and error until one of them worked.
Sure, why not?
And then they stayed with that, right?
Yeah.
And that's the way we get some of our modern medicines today.
In this PDF, they talk about how they could track migrations of people.
Right,
with
that's the
parasites.
other
In fact, this is a big area of study.
It's huge.
Huge. They can track what
Yes,
people ate and
that's right.
where they went.
Exactly right.
And they also say here that in the New World,
Yes.
much fewer parasite infections.
That's right.
Right? And they have here European, Portuguese, and Spanish sailors, when they get to the New World, they said it's a paradise with healthy and happy people and no disease.
Right. Let's give them some.
Yeah, right.
Hey, Giuseppe, come on over here.
Interesting.
Right.
Very interesting.
Very interesting.
So I'll put a link to that.
Yep.
In the show notes. And there are a bunch of other articles that
Sure.
Dickson found. One is called Paleoparasitology in Japan, Discovery of Toilet Features.
Right.
It's an amazing article where they're excavating old toilets in towns in Japan, and they're looking at how they disposed of excrement, right?
Exactly.
And the parasites recovered from these toilets, which they can do because they're preserved, right,
true.
by layers and layers of dirt.
Absolutely.
They include many species that infect humans today.
Right.
Ascarid roundworms were absent
And they had
and only
Paragonus.
became common with rice agriculture.
Exactly. So agriculture and human settlement, and then what do you do with all that feces that you're going to accumulate now? You're not hunting and gathering. You're not leaving a trail of feces behind you. You're accumulating it on site.
Right.
And if they didn't use it for fertilizer, then it was still available to be analyzed.
And they say here, finds of pollen and seeds in toilet sediments reveal the use of medicinal plants to control the emerging problem of parasites.
Right. But it also tells you what they were eating.
Yeah.
You
Well,
know,
these things, they say, were probably used to control parasites because not all of them would be for food, right?
You know what else they can find, Vincent? They can find evidence of cannibalism.
Really?
Yeah, they can tell you whether or not people were eating other people by doing PCR analysis on some of the intact coprolite material and seeing whether or not you have human proteins
Yeah.
from muscle tissue.
So here's some of the parasitics they found in this Japanese site.
Tell us.
Ascaris lumbricoides,
Of course.
Trichuris trichiura,
Absolutely.
Clonorchus sinensis. Didn't we talk about Clonorchus?
Yeah, we've talked about Clonorchus.
Remind me?
You get it by eating fish, raw fish.
It is a roundworm.
Yes. No. It's a fluke. It's
Fluke?
a fluke. It's a trematode.
And Megagonius yokogawai.
Yeah, megagon.
What's that?
No. Metagonomous yukogawa.
Yeah, right.
Metagonomous
That's what I said.
yukogawa. Yeah, you were close. You were close. It's another parasite that you get by eating fish.
Okay, so they would have eaten fish there, right?
Lots. Some of them you get from eating the husks of water chestnuts, right? Phaseolopsis buski is the one you can get like that. And Fasciola hepatica, of course, you could get by eating watercress.
And later on, they found pork and beef tapeworm eggs because they
about
started to eat meat, I suppose.
Well, pork and beef are identical, so I don't know how they would actually distinguish those two.
This is fascinating article.
And they found fish tapeworms. They found Diphyllobothrium.
They have diagrams of the toilets and how they were drained into flushing toilets and all that stuff.
Sure, absolutely.
Wow. This is a whole science. It's incredible.
Yep.
So that's a good one.
It's like ancient forensics.
Then they have there was another article you found from Oswaldo Cruz also, the state of the art of paleoparasitological research in the old world.
Right.
And they talk about all the parasites they found, trematodes, Dicrosoelidae, and Fasciolidae. I'm massacring them. Schistosomes, which we mentioned. Cestodes like Taenia.
Exactly.
Ascarids. Trichiurus, right?
Yep.
Protozoans.
Yep.
There's not much of that because
they don't survive well.
Cool.
But also
parasite fossil record.
I know, and it described how they do it too. They shave off a little piece, and then they acidify it in various acid baths, and then they remove all of the mineralization, revealing the actual intact unit.
Here's another article on paleoparasitological study on the soils collected from archaeological sites in the old district of Seoul City.
Right.
And these are, they found Clonorchus,
Yep.
Diphyllobothrium,
Yep, fish tapeworm,
Ascaris, and Trichurus.
Yep.
And this is 14th to 19th centuries.
Yeah.
14th century. It's
That's right.
quite old.
Yes.
That's 1300, right?
That's right. So it tells you that they weren't eating cooked fish. They were eating raw fish.
From all of those?
Well, from
Some of them.
Diphyllobothrium latum, that's how you get it. You get it by eating raw fish. If you cook it, it kills it.
Wow.
Right. So you learn a lot about...
So, you think about archaeological digs, they're finding pottery, utensils, but they can, if they're careful, they can find parasites.
Right. And people that settled into areas had a specific place that they used to defecate.
Right.
So if you find out where that is, you have a treasure trove of history, of eating, of their infections, of how extensive these habits were. And
And this is an important addition to archaeology.
Sure.
So if you're training as an archaeologist, you have to be trained how to spot these eggs and see what they are.
You do.
And make sure you don't destroy them.
You could probably rely on somebody else for
Yeah.
that one, but
You just
have to
collect
collaborate.
them. You collect them, you say what layer they're in, and then
that's
you
right.
show them to someone else.
Exactly.
They could ask you to identify them, right?
They haven't done that yet, but I'm happy to do it if they do. But I think there are plenty of other people
This is
out
so
there.
cool.
It's very nice.
Let's see, what else we got? Paleoepidemiology of Chagas disease. We haven't mentioned this.
Well, I just did. I actually
Did you?
I did T. cruzi before.
Pre-Columbian populations in
That's right.
the Andean region, in
That's right.
Brazil, and North American desert.
Sure.
9,000-year-old mummies.
Yeah. Now, remember what I told you about?
Where would you find Chagas? What kind of evidence would you find showing that they're
Well,
Chagas?
I have two kinds of evidence. One is in the pottery, because in everyday pottery, they depicted everyday life. So pre-Columbian art. In fact, at the Anthropological Museum in Mexico City, I had the privilege of being in that museum with a man who was extremely knowledgeable in the field of parasitology, John David, who was the former chairman of the Department of Parasitology up at Harvard. So he and I both stood there and looked at these little statuettes of everyday life, and they would depict people with a broken leg, for instance, or teeth that were missing. And there was one, and we'll post that on the show notes also, and I took a picture of it. It was a person with a shagoma.
Uh-huh.
One of the eyes was completely shut, and a big bulging cellulitis resulted, and that's called Ramonia's sign, and that's absolutely pathognomonic for Chagas disease in certain areas where it's endemic. There are other things that can cause it, but if you look throughout Central and South America, the shagoma that's produced by the trypanosomes results in this feature. So here was one evidence that if you date the statue, you can see that it was a common infection among the Aztecs or the Incas or the Mayans. And the other way, of course, is to get a mummy and then do PCR and see if you can find some remnants of the trypanosome itself. And they did. They found remnants of it.
So here they say one of these mummies had the pelvic girdle full of fecal mass, suggesting megacolon disease, one of Chagas disease's clinical manifestations.
Yes, it is.
They showed the presence of hookworm and echinostoma eggs.
Good. Okay,
And they
so
also
that's a good one.
did PCR, and they got T. cruzi DNA.
Right.
So this is 600-year-old stuff.
Yeah. And how do they know it was T. cruzi?
Oh, look, 7,000-year-old body was also positive for T. cruzi.
Right.
How did they know?
Very common.
PCR.
Sure.
Right.
But what part of the T. cruzi organism would you try to get sequences on which could never match up with anything else except T. cruzi?
The apicoplast.
No, they don't have one of those.
They don't have an apicoplast.
No, but they do have something else, a plast. They have a kinetoplast.
Kinetoplast. I was in the right plast.
You were the plasting. You were plasting in the correct
Wow.
area. So kinetoplast
That's really
would
cool.
have only mini circles and maxi circles from trypanosomes.
Here's another article you found. Molecular paleoparasitological diagnosis of asterisks from Coprolites, new scenery of ascariasis in pre-Columbian South America.
Right.
Asterisks. That's 8,000 years ago.
So one of the speculations I read about in some of these articles suggested that people who migrated through the Bering Straits when the land bridge was still intact probably didn't transmit their parasites to each other because it was too cold.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and I'm not sure I would buy into that.
Yeah, I
argument.
saw that in one of these
You
articles.
know, these
yeah.
parasite eggs are pretty hardy, and they would survive through that condition, I'm afraid.
Yeah.
And so just using that as the argument, well, then they had to come from some other direction. Like, the Polynesians could have come across to South America directly rather than all the way around the other way. And there is some debate among archaeologists and paleontologists as to when the first humans arrived in North America and South America. When did they first arrive? And, they're looking for evidence that suggests that the South American population of people arose before the land bridge was bridged by people coming the hard way. Because it was easier to get there by boat,
Sure. Yeah.
obviously, right? But very,
Yeah, here's this article. They say
very tenuous.
these parasites, A. lumbricoides and Trichiura, could not have been supported by the cold climate of the region. Nomadic prehistoric humans have crossed the Bering Land Bridge from Asia to the Americas. Probably during generations would have lost these parasites whose life cycles need warm temperatures in the soil to be transmitted from host to host. Alternative routes are needed for human parasite
But
introduction.
my answer to that would be yes, but these people didn't live naked out in the cold. Trust me, they were living in either igloos or caves or some other place where they could heat it.
And the eggs would be preserved.
Yeah, that's right. And so they might have soiled their own habitat.
Well, I think you should work in this field, clearly. 'Cause you
Well,
have
I'm old
the-
enough, that's for sure.
You have the expertise. Now, here's a paper called, it's in PLOS One also.
Yeah.
It just published in January of this year.
Oh, yes.
We might have discussed it. It's called Tapeworm Eggs in a 270 million year old shark coprolite.
Right.
Oh my gosh, we did
Right.
discuss this. Someone brought this to our
That's
attention.
right. That's right.
270 million years old.
Yep.
They
That's a
had to
long
be
time.
there a long time.
That's a long time.
As we've discussed, you were right. They regulate populations, these
They
parasites.
do. They have to. I
So-
mean, viruses. I would throw that into the same mix.
Well, of course, the viruses
They're
have been
very
there
parasitic.
a really long time.
Yeah.
Probably before the parasites, the eukaryotic
That's right.
parasites, because they
That's
just
right.
needed a single cell.
Correct.
Right.
That's correct.
So this is a huge field,
Yep.
which I was completely ignorant about.
I'm so pleased. Now that I know David Baltimore's 7 mechanisms for reproduction of viruses, that's the knowledge that you imparted
I
from me.
hope that our
to me, I should
listeners
say.
learned something here, that you can actually find
It's good stuff.
these parasites in
It's very good
fossils
stuff.
of various sorts.
Opens up a whole new way of looking
So
at
we have
people.
dinosaurs had
Yep.
a parasite
Of course.
infection, all kinds of animals, these
Sharks. Yeah.
people, as far back as we can get their coprolites, we can
Exactly.
find it. Their mummies, we
Yep.
can find it.
Yep.
And so it must have been way, way back there.
In fact, one of the speculations that I'm very fond of, although I'm not sure of where I read this or how accurate it is, was that when the human population was at around 400,000 individuals.
Mm-hmm.
They saw a bottleneck of evolution, all right? And if you look at what 400,000 individuals represents in terms of a population, that's largely inbred.
Yeah.
It's very homogeneous in terms of its genetics. And all you need is one parasite that's lethal to sweep through there as an epidemic, and you could lose everybody.
Yeah. Because you don't have enough diversity to keep.
Exactly.
So have a few resistant people to keep.
Yeah,
right?
their estimate was that it's lucky we didn't get wiped out by malaria, which could have come from, non-hominid primates, and it infected people and just knocked them all out when we were down to 400,000.
So when the world had 400,000, this is Homo sapiens you're talking about? You probably only saw your immediate little group of what? 50 people or 100 people?
And they must have all looked exactly
alike. And you all
alike.
interbred, right?
Right.
And you didn't travel. It was cold. Life was tough.
Well, remember they migrated south to South Africa and then up into Namibia also as a refuge. And the speculation there was that we were chased out by the introduction of hyenas from Europe who wanted those bones. And hey, wait a minute, that's my bone. No, where did you guys come from? Who said you could eat that bone? And they had very strong jaws because they can eat elephant and hippo bones. Mm-hmm. So we had to sort of get out of there. And then when the ocean levels dropped because of another ice age, we could then migrate around them and avoid contact with those predators when we escaped through the Arabian Peninsula up into Eurasia.
What is this week in...
Ancient hominids.
No, there's a name for that. What's the name for that field?
Human migration.
Yeah, human migration.
Yeah.
Paleology?
Paleontology.
Paleontology.
I think it's archaeology and paleontology. Yeah, both of those fields sort of meld together.
I took some kind of course in college. It was so boring. You're just talking about shards of pottery. And it didn't make any sense. But you make it interesting. No. You should have been my professor. Actually, when you introduce modern genetics, makes it much more interesting.
That does it.
Because then you could see how people
Don't you wish Mendel and even Dobzhansky could have lived long enough to see the extension of their thought pattern into the modern era?
I have to tell you, I had a thought today.
Yeah.
I felt the way Leeuwenhoek must have felt when he made this microscope and he was looking everywhere.
Yeah, sure.
And I thought today I would like to have a deep sequencer on my bench and just sequence everything.
That would be great.
All kinds of specimens. I would start with myself. I would sequence, my urine, my feces, my blood, my saliva.
Sure.
And then I'd move into the environment. If it were cheap enough that you could do that, wouldn't it? That's sort of the Leeuwenhoek moment, isn't it?
It puts your mind in so many different places all at once that you start speculating about the origins of everything then, don't you?
It's great.
It is.
Science is amazing.
Truly. I totally agree.
Email?
Sure.
Ian writes, Dear TWiPers, I just finished listening to the superb TWiP number 56. Do you know what that was about?
No.
Whirling disease.
Whirling. Oh, good. Okay.
And I am thrilled because I am a huge fish nerd.
Right. Oh, good.
In fact, I spent much of my youth catching and chasing fish on the same lovely New Jersey barrier island mentioned in that episode. That's where I have a home.
That's right.
In my enthusiasm, I wanted to write in with a few thoughts. The first is nitpicking. But the gar discussed around 13 minutes is more likely a specimen of Atlantic needlefish, Strongylura marina, than a member of the true gar family Lipostidae. Like members of Lepisostidae, I can't pronounce it, needlefish have elongated tubular body plans and are sometimes referred to in common usage as gar. Needlefish often spend time at the surface but do not gulp air in the cool way fish such as the Florida gar do. This mix-up might explain Dickson's surprise at hearing about gar so far north.
Oh, I see.
As an aside, I might add that I have heard that if presented with a fly small enough to fit in their diminutive mouth, needlefish make for wonderful sport fish. I myself have caught a needlefish on Barnegat Bay, although not in the manner one might think. I spend my free time sailing a catamaran around the bay. On one windy day, I had the rude surprise of a large needlefish jumping out of the water and landing in my boat.
I once caught a baby tarpon like that, too.
My crew and I were as shocked as
Funny.
the fish. It was a memorable experience, particularly because, like many angry fish, the needlefish displayed a heightened, more vibrant coloration than I usually get to see.
That's right.
The fish was promptly returned to the water, and I was left relieved that I hadn't been added to the list of people who
Very
have been
cool.
impaled by needlefish.
cool.
And he sends a link to an article
That's great.
talking about impaling. In the spirit of This Week in Fish, I would like to suggest The Founding Fish by John McPhee
Oh, yeah, read it.
as a pick of the week.
That's a shad. He talks
The book
about
is a
shad.
wonderful examination
That's
of
right.
everything shad,
That's right.
written by a wonderfully gifted writer.
Correct.
I'm picking it because TWiP number 56 included a question about shad's tastiness.
Uh-huh.
As the book points out, the species name of the American shad, Alosa sapidissima, translates to most delicious. I am salivating just thinking about a meal of baked shad, perhaps with a side of Atlantic blue crab, whose species name also derives from sapidus, the Latin word for savory. As always, much thanks for all the work that goes into the TWiX podcasts. I'm about to leave on a road trip across the U.S. in order to start grad school for biology, and I'm looking forward to having tales of viruses, microbes, and parasites keep me company along the way.
Cool.
I remember as a kid, we used to go out on party boats, and once someone landed a bonita.
Oh, yeah.
And the guy said, "Watch for the tuna disco dance right now." And they move around. They turn all different colors.
They do.
The disco dance,
They
he
do.
called it.
If you catch a bonita now on any of these guided fly fishing trips to, let's say, Montauk, the guide will take out a priest, which is a club used to kill fish with, by the way, and they will kill the bonita on the spot. They will clean it. They will then dice it up into little bite-sized bits, and you can have sashimi. It is phenomenal.
No parasite danger?
Not if you kill it right away, and you get out the guts.
Why? Because the parasites
you-
don't have time to move out into the flesh?
Exactly.
So, too bad Ian went to the West Coast, because maybe I would see him in Barnegat Bay, because that's where we sail.
That's true.
Although now we're not sailing because it's
No.
the fall. Howell writes, "Dear professors, first of all, thank you for producing such fascinating podcasts. I got interested in parasites when I read Carl Zimmer's book. I've just discovered TWiP through Professor Racaniello's course on Coursera, and I intend to try and listen to them all. I've got one question so far. Is the cover photo for the page of Trichinella, our TWiP page?
Yeah, it is.
What is it, Dickson? Tell him."
It's the nurse cell, which is a modified portion of striated skeletal muscle, which the parasite engineers from a normal piece of muscle into its home. And it can be then completely anatomically isolated from the rest of that muscle cell, which is much longer than the piece that the parasite ends up using. And the way it's made is very complicated. So I highly recommend this writer and listener to go to my website on trichinella.org, because there's an entire section there on the development of that nurse cell. And you can learn a little bit more about that. And maybe next to Carl Zimmer's book, he could find room for my little tome that I just produced.
I'm sure he'll come across that episode of TWiP. And
Talking about self-promoting.
It's fine. Andy writes, "Dr. Despommier,
Yes.
I enjoy your show, although parasites are not related in any way to what I do for a living.
Good.
You have mentioned the death of the S.A. Andre's Arctic balloon expedition
Yes.
of 1897
Yes.
crew in a couple of TWiPs,
Yes.
including in episode 60, and how they probably died of trichinosis from eating polar bear.
Right.
He puts a link to the Wikipedia entry. I was fascinated by this and repeated it a couple of times to friends, but when I was looking for details, I came across this entry in Wikipedia, which says the theory was discredited in 2010. The cited links are in Swedish, and one appears to be broken. The other one is very brief, but using Google Translate, it says that they think it was polar bears killing them instead. Obviously, anyone can put whatever they want on the internet, but I wonder, what are your thoughts on this?
Well, my thoughts were that if polar bears had killed them, then there would be plenty of evidence for missing pieces of people. When they chopped off a hand or a leg or something like this and dragged it off to eat it. And then there would be bite marks all over the bones when they would, get it down to the bone level, so to speak, and that was not part of the original findings, and so therefore they were looking for other causes.
So there is a link here on the Wikipedia page. It says, in 2010, the theory that larvae of Trichinella killed the expedition was rejected by researcher Bea Usma Schiffert at Karolinska Institute, Sweden. Her conclusion after examining the clothes is that at least Strindberg was killed by polar bears.
Right, but there were 3 altogether, so...
I mean, there are many other
But their
ways
diarrhea
they
also
died.
indicates that they got very sick.
Yeah, it says they had diarrhea, but that could have been just because of the general misery.
Possible.
He said some symptoms of trichinosis are missing. Other people have lived largely on polar bear meat in exactly the same area for a long time without ill effects. Vitamin A poisoning, carbon monoxide poisoning.
Sure.
So
No, it's a
lead
speculation.
poisoning from the cans, scurvy, botulism, suicide. They had plenty of opium. So they should look in their coprolites. Trichinella. What would you find?
You would find the adult worms, perhaps.
And they would be gone.
They'd be gone. Look in the muscle tissue. You see, that's where you could actually do a good PCR on the muscle tissue, and you could find out whether they were infected.
So Bea Usma.
Why don't they do that?
Sorry, say that again?
You should take pieces of their muscle tissue and do a PCR for Trichinella.
I wonder if Bea Usma, she has a Wikipedia page, and she does have a book here, and Bea Usma Schiffert wrote The Man Who Went to the Far Side of the Moon, Apollo 11, but I don't know if that's the same Bea.
No.
Who knows? She speaks Swedish. We could email her and ask her, but I don't know anything more. So there you go.
Right.
Andy, by the way, is a electrical engineer.
Great.
In the Launch Systems Group at Orbital Sciences Corporation.
Excellent.
Maybe he launches rockets.
Oh, no, it sounds great.
Tommy writes, Dear Vincent and Dickson, just a note about something that Dickson mentioned in TWiP 60. I'm sure Dickson realized that he simply misspoke after it went on the air.
I'm sure.
But the Diginian responsible for the barber pole effect, Leucochloridium paradoxum, is not a schistosome but belongs to the Leucochloridae family, which is on an entirely different branch of the Dignian fluke tree to the schistosomes.
Okay.
There are many different species of Leucochloridium,
It's still a trematode.
and they come in different colors. For example, Leucochloridium paradoxum have green bands or red-brown bands on its sporocyst blood sac, brood sac, the structure which invades the tentacles of the infected snail, whereas Leucochloridium milsei has yellow or orange-yellow bands. A good paper on this topic is below. It gives a couple of papers.
Point well taken.
Additionally, there is some indication that the behavior of the snail is altered, as noted in this paper, which he provides a link to. It was cited in Janice Moore's 2002 book, Parasites in the Behavior of Animals. Wessenberg Lund notes that it seems as if the infested snails seek the light. They are often seen balancing on the borders of the leaves or sitting on the underside of the leaves with only the antenna infested with the Leucochloridium protruding from the border of the leaves.
Saying, eat me, eat
Now
me.
compare this with the behavior of most terrestrial snails, which prefer more damp and secluded surroundings. Such altered behavior would expose the snail and its brightly colored parasite to predation by the potential bird host. As a side note, here is a link to a cartoon I drew about Leucochloridium a few years ago. It contains a pop culture reference which might not be obvious to everyone, though most people below a certain age would immediately recognize it. For the listener who cannot see imagine it is a reference to the 2003 song Milkshake by Kellis.
You're
Keep
right,
up.
I wouldn't have gotten that.
I wouldn't either. Keep up the good work, Vincent and Dickson. I look forward to more parasite tales from you in the future. Here's the cartoon, Dickson. I don't know if you got the pop culture reference.
No, I don't, because I don't know the group that they were referring to.
My eye
but-
stalks bring all the birds to the yard, and they're like, it's caterpillars. I don't know. Ooh, this is interesting. It's a DeviantArt page. Is this yours, Tommy? Anyway, Tommy is our friend who has written before.
Good.
Who worked on making the parasite that infects the leg of the clam that makes it stay out and get eaten. the leg of the clams. The clams. What is that thing called? Come on, Dickson.
Foot.
The foot. Thank you. The flukes.
Siphon.
These parasites, they go in there and they make the clams not move, and they stay on the sand and they get eaten by birds.
Okay.
Oh, what is the name of that particular? Cockles. Cockles.
Ah.
Anyway, he works on them. We're going to have him on TWiP. He's in Australia.
Great.
When can you do a TWiP at 6 p.m.?
Exactly.
Because that's when his time is up.
Exactly.
You're going to have to stay some night.
I guess.
I'll provide wine, okay?
That'll be wonderful. It'll be a totally different kind of TWiP, I can tell you that.
Robin writes, toxoplasmic humans. It ain't just mice that have adverse behavioral outcomes with toxoplasma. He sends a link to a series of articles which suggests that toxoplasma has an effect on humans. For example, increased incidence of traffic accidents in toxoplasma-infected military drivers. Another one.
I think we should turn that email around
Increased
and send it to
risk
John
of traffic
Boothroyd and see what he
accidents.
thinks.
But John Boothroyd, yes, he didn't believe
He's
any
the
of
gold
this.
standard for toxo research.
So, Robin, we had John Boothroyd on.
I
He
know.
said he doesn't believe any of it.
No, because, I mean, the fact that you can't smell the urine of a cat is not going to really... In fact, you can live with more cats if that happens, if you have toxo. So I don't think it's
High prevalence
gonna
of
work.
toxo infection in a subset of Mexican patients with work accidents and low socioeconomic status, for example. So I don't know that these are particularly convincing. They're all associative, right, Dickson?
You know why? Because so many people are infected with toxo.
Yeah, right.
So
How
many.
can you do it?
And then, in France, 80%. And, they may be crazy drivers,
Sacre
but they
bleu.
don't just bumping into each other
Dickson,
all the
and
time.
he concludes, should humans attacked or killed by big cats be checked for toxoplasmosis?
Zookeepers, the one just got his hand bitten off almost from a tiger.
Our last one is from Suzanne, who writes,
Okay,
thank you for the BT and mosquito information.
Oh, right.
I had a feeling there had to be a catch. Since there's always plenty of other water that isn't treated,
Yeah.
I expect BT wouldn't become completely useless, but it's good to know it's not a wonder fix either.
Nope.
Ah, well.
There isn't anything such as a wonder fix, unfortunately. We thought there was, but that was before the drug companies finally bought into the evolutionary theory of life on Earth.
If people would like to ask questions and comments, they can email them to us at twip@twiv.tv. That's TWIP at twiv.tv. I know it's a little weird, but I like to get all the email at that one domain name.
Right.
This episode of TWiP will be found at iTunes or at microbeworld.org/TWiP. And if you enjoyed the program, go over to iTunes and leave a rating for us. That helps to keep the show visible. We want more listeners, right, Dickson?
You bet.
Because we're starting to do it a little more frequently, right?
We are. It's almost This Week in Parasitism.
This Dickson is into it. It's every other week for a couple of weeks
no, come
now.
on. I love doing this.
And we'll have to find another topic for 2 weeks from
Oh,
now.
that's not a problem. That's not a problem.
Dixon Despommier can be found when he's not here. I often see him outside in my office writing.
Yeah.
He's writing books. He's an author.
Trying to.
He's at verticalfarm.com, trichomonas.org, and medicalecology.com. Thank you, Dickson, as always.
Welcome, Vincent.
Was it a pleasure?
It was an extreme pleasure.
Do you like your new mic?
I loved my new mic.
Yeah, it
There's a
sounds
lot
good.
more freedom associated with it.
Yeah?
Yeah, sure. I can
Also,
move
I don't
around.
hear the clicking noise as the mic shakes.
And you
The
won't
other
hear all that obnoxious
Heavy breathing.
breathing.
You're right.
I think you won't hear any of that.
No.
No. See, it wasn't me doing it to begin with. It was somebody else, and this proves it.
I have to thank Ray Ortega for suggesting that mic. I was
It looks
complaining.
very professional, very professional. It makes me feel as though I'm in a sound studio.
So let us know if you like Dixon's new sound.
Right. And if not, we'll go back to the old system.
Yeah. I'm Vincent Racaniello. You can find me at virology.ws. The music that you hear at the beginning and the end of TWiP is composed and performed by Ronald Jenkins. You can find his work at ronaldjenkins.com. You like his music, Dickson?
I do.
You ever listen to it?
I do.
You ever listen to TWiP?
Sometimes.
Okay.
I can hear it live, you know.
You've been listening to This Week in Parasitism. Thanks for joining us. We'll be back soon. Another TWiP is parasitic.